Now, we're going to pick up the pace a little bit. So if you needed to stretch your legs, I hope you already did, because now we're going to pick up the pace. Welcome to Italian Americans Talk Korea. This is Joe Sorrentione, Carol Giacomo from the New York Times, Suzanne DiMaggio from New America, Bob Gallucci from Georgetown University. Joe Giraldi, I think, was available now, but this is a new podcast. But in addition to sharing a certain ethnic heritage, my three panelists here have all just come back from the Korean Peninsula. And what I want to do is just start having a conversation with them. This is not a series of long presentations. This is a discussion. I'd like your reactions to some of what you've just heard, some of what you're observing. But right away, I want to start with Suzanne and tell us about your encounter in Moscow and what you drew from that. Tell us what you were doing there and who you shared the stage with.
Great. Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Plowshares, and thank you for all of you for being here today and for supporting this great organization. I was in Moscow to participate in the 2017 Moscow Non-Proliferation Conference and was invited to be a panelist on with a group to discuss how to de-escalate the North Korean situation. And one of my co-panelists was Madam Chae San-hui, who is a senior North Korean diplomat and heads up the Americas division at their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I had met her before, both in past trips to Pyongyang and in various European capitals. But it was an unusual opportunity for, I think, a North Korean and American to be on stage together in a public format to discuss these issues. So if I can go ahead, I just would like to briefly outline what Madam Chae said. Of course, she has said these things to some Americans in private, but I thought that this was an opportunity for her to use this public platform to clarify, first, their current policy, second, to explain why they have gone this route of nuclear weapons. Second, to describe their intentions going forward. And then also, third, to talk about the prospects for U.S. North Korea direct diplomatic engagement. So first, she talked about why they've gone the route of nuclear weapons, and she made it very clear, and we've certainly heard this before, and I think we've all come to accept it, that it's a strategic choice on their part to develop nuclear weapons because they see it as the only way, the only reliable means to deter U.S. aggression. She made it very clear, brought up the examples of both Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We're not going to repeat the same mistakes they made. In terms
you mean giving up their weapons and then have America kill you?
Exactly. Second, in terms of intention, she also made it very clear that her government is going to continue to develop its nuclear weapon and missile programs until it reaches, quote, a balance of power with the United States. And others have said this before. They've called it an equilibrium. So her point was they are going to move full steam ahead, and as we've seen, they've been unflinching in their focus on these goals. And then finally, on the idea of direct U.S. North Korea engagement, she outlined the steps that the U.S. would have to take in order for there to be bilateral talks. It's a common term we hear in this topic. Hostile policies is what they call it. So the first one, and she has a way with words, so she said the U.S. should halt its hostile rhetoric and, quote, crazy statements made by the, quote, so-called president. Second, stop provocative military exercises and nuclear threats. And third, abandon the barbarous, quote, sanctions aimed at suffocating the DPRK. She said if these steps were taken, that would create the right atmosphere. What she didn't address is the sequencing. Are these expected up front? Would they be negotiated? My sense is she understands they would have to be negotiated in exchange for other things. My sense is that she used this opportunity to clarify these viewpoints. She did not completely shut the door to engagement. She left it open a bit, very narrowly. And if I was a member of this current administration, I would look at what she said very carefully and listen. I was struck by what Bill Perry said in the earlier panel conversation with him, where he said, good diplomats not only have golden tongues, but they have golden ears. And I think this administration would be well served to listen to what she had to say.
Let me pin you down on that, because if I understand what most administration officials are saying, and I think this is what Chris just said, is that North Korea does not want to talk right now. But isn't there some truth to that? Haven't they rebuffed efforts to talk?
Well, my understanding is, as you know, Joe, we had a Track 1.5 meeting in Oslo in May, and this has been reported in the press, so I can talk about it.
Could you just explain what that is, please?
Track 1.5 is between Track 1, which is official engagement between government officials, and Track 2 is from non-governmental people who engage in these talks. It's called Track 1.5 because on the North Korean side, they are all officials that we're engaging with, and on our side, they're non-officials. Many former senior officials, former senior diplomats, former military leaders, and so forth, but no sitting government officials. So for this last conversation we had in May, the Trump administration did authorize an official from the State Department to come to Oslo, and that was the first interaction, official to official, during the Trump administration. And those talks led to the release of Otto Warmbier, and I think could have continued to be an ongoing channel if it was handled correctly. But I think what we've seen now between President Trump's speech, the fiery speech at the UN General Assembly, where he personalized the insults directly at Kim Jong-un, combined with the tweets that have also been quite threatening, I think it has really cut off the possibility to continue official-to-official engagement at this moment. But I would say that we should be exploring every avenue to get that back on track.
Okay, let me have you pause there. And Carol, I want to, if you could share with us some of the impressions you took away from your recent trip to North Korea. You wrote very eloquently about this in the New York Times, but I would just ask you to share with the audience those few people who didn't read that column.
Sorry.
Yeah, just keep it going.
It goes? Okay, sorry. Look, my bottom line was this. I really felt that they had a plan.
They, the North Koreans.
They, the North Koreans, had a plan, and we don't. It just seemed to me that the message, it's an authoritarian state, a totalitarian state, so everybody was on message, and it really reflected in the basic structure what Suzanne just said. But I still felt that they knew where they were going. I really do think they want to talk to the United States, but they say this is not the moment, and they are making demands. And I do think the whole UN speech just put them over the edge. I mean, that was everybody, whether it was, and again, this place is just awash in propaganda, but students, young students, older students, silk workers, everybody that we talked to referenced, why are you attacking our leader like this? So it has resonated with the population, for sure. The other sort of huge takeaway is that they don't know who to talk to. People, the senior people we talked to who work for Madam Che, said, well, what about Tillerson? Well, what about Tillerson? He really, the president has undercut his credibility, and so you have to look for somebody else, I think, outside the system to make, an end run to develop some sort of channel with the North Koreans so that you can get some kind of dialogue going.
Bob, you just came back from South Korea. I know you have things to say about the North, but what are the South Koreans worried about? What are they talking to you about on your trip?
Joe, first, thanks for having me today. Thanks for letting me be with you all. So I spent the week in Seoul last week, Monday with a long meeting with President Moon, and then Tuesday, lots of meetings with members of their assembly, our equivalent of our Congress. And I'm convinced that the more attentive public in Seoul is actually concerned, but you can't see anything in the streets. I mean, everybody behaves quite normally and that nothing's going on particularly, but the people who know about this and follow it, people who would come to a meeting like this, you know, know that things are worse now than they can remember, and some of them ask me, well, is this as bad as 93, 94, and are not thrilled when I say, oh, much worse. And then the next thing is that they are not, you will not be surprised to hear this, and I'm not trying to be cute or funny, they're not so worried about the North. I mean, what's new is the United States of America. I mean, one of the things that sounds odd to me when I hear Suzanne and Carol say it is the North Koreans are complaining about the language used by the President of the United States. You know, and has risen to the top of the list, because I've done my own, a number of tracks, 1.5 with the North Koreans, and I've gotten some of this stuff, and I always tell them, you know, you ought to stop this language, because the North Koreans actually say things like, you know, we will devastate your country, and they have these little logo. The last one I did was in Kuala Lumpur exactly a year ago with them, and I said I didn't like the picture on YouTube I saw of a mushroom cloud over New York City. And my interlocutor, Han, said, he laughed. And I said, I have a daughter who lives in New York City. This isn't funny to me, right? And that kind of stuff, serious people don't do. So, I mean, I'm not telling you I was thrilled to see my president at the UN speaking like somebody at a high school assembly, but I do want to give it back to them and say, this is not the way to behave. So there's a little bit of this reaction in me. But to go to your question, the South Koreans, to see this from us, from a president, is new to them, and they are worried. They also, I mean, with all due respect to Chris, I mean, when he started and said, you know, there's a range of policies, you know, you can adopt to North Korea, and I was thinking, yeah, and your administration has taken all of them. I mean, you got negotiation at one end, and you got a let's go to war right now and incinerate them at the other end, and they've embraced it all. And it's very hard to know, and the South Korean position is, we don't know what he's going to do. We think we know what the North is going to do. We've been dealing with this for a long time. What we don't know, the new element, why do we have a crisis? The United States has defined this as a crisis. I don't mean we've manufactured it. The North is trying to change the facts on the ground, and I think that's objectively true. But that it is a crisis that could lead to a war is because the president, you recall when he drew a pink line, there should be a rule of international law, you can't draw a red line with a tweet, but he, in January, did, when he responded to the statement of Kim Jong-un, the January message, we're going to develop an ICBM, with not going to happen. And ever since that moment, we've wondered whether the next test, if it's at range in an ICBM, would lead to a U.S. left of launch, kinetic, whatever you want to call it, but some sort of strike against the North. That's what they're thinking in South Korea now, I think.
They're thinking that there might be another test. Well, let me back up. There already have been 2 tests at range. They have 2 tests
Altitude.
of ICBMs.
They were at altitude. They were not at range. So, in other words, they were not downrange in the Pacific. And so, and we sucked them up, right? So, if there is one, I mean, the questions that people are asking right now is, what's the trigger for U.S. action? I mean, nobody thinks that North Koreans are going to get up one morning and decide to attack the United States of America or South Korea. The question is framed much more, I think, reasonably, as what is it that the North may think they will get away with without provoking a U.S. military response, and get wrong in that calculation. Because the things that Ri Yong-ho mentioned at the UN was, one, a splashdown of IRBM warheads around Guam, two, an airburst of a nuclear weapon over the Pacific, and three, by reference already made, to a ICBM test in which they can really test the reentry warhead for the temperatures and other pressures on that working warhead with sensors, so they could know they really would have a way of delivering a warhead to the United States. It would be credible, it would be noticeable, because it would actually travel 6,000 miles instead of up and down. So any number of things the North could do could be a trigger for an immediate response by the United States against some easily imaginable package of targets.
Suzanne, what do you think? Where are they going? What's North Korea going to do? We are in a pause right now. It's been over a month since their last test. Somebody here must know, but I think it's been about 35 days, which is the longest it's been in between tests.
Beginning of the administration, yes.
Yeah.
So I think the two questions we should be asking are the North Koreans now satisfied that they've demonstrated enough capacity to have a strong deterrent capacity, that we would view it that way? I don't think they're there yet. I think they still have a couple of more tests in them, and they've said so as much. The second is, do they feel they've demonstrated enough capacity that when they come to the table, they're going to feel strong and confident? And again, I think they're very confident now, more confident than I've seen them in the 2 years I've been talking to them. But again, I still think they have a couple of more tests left in them.
So Foreign Minister Ri said something like this, if I read his speech, and you read them more closely than I do, that we are a few steps away from finalizing the state nuclear program,
Yes.
right?
And
And I took that to mean what I think you're saying. They have a couple more things they want to test.
Yes, they want to check the box on a couple of more things. Now, what worries me is on this side, well, we've heard the president say, and McMaster and Pompeo have backed it up, that they are not going to allow them to fulfill that capacity. So this is where I think we run the risk of some miscalculation, misinterpretation, and with the lack of direct, reliable channels to clarify these things. So if indeed this is a red line for President Trump, we really need to relay that to them clearly and in a consistent way. Yes, maybe predictability works in foreign policy sometimes, but when nuclear weapons are involved, I don't recommend unpredictability.
So let me just ask all of you, are there any secret negotiations going on? Is there something we don't know about that you've heard about? Yes, I know what I'm asking. But what do you think? Have you
Not
heard
anymore.
have you heard of anything at all? But was it your paper that was reporting on the Washington Post that Joseph Yun is frustrated because he feels even that channel is being shut down now?
Well, I think there's a couple of channels open for communication, but in terms of negotiation, no way. And I wouldn't even say we should jump to negotiations right away. I would recommend that we first begin with talks about talks that are authorized at the highest level to engage the North Koreans in discussions about asking them to clarify their policy. What's their end game? What we see as the end game. Similar to what we did with the Iranians before we began negotiations on the nuclear deal.
You know, I think it's worth pointing out, even if there aren't, I mean, I hope there are secret negotiations that we don't know about, I really do. But I find it very interesting that over the past year, they have invited in not just some experts who have been invited in before, but also different groups of American media. You know, we went for 5 days in September, the end of September. The New Yorker was there, the Wall Street Journal was there, NBC I think was there, CBS was there. This is unusual. I mean, they will often invite international media in during galas, party congress or big meetings when they, all you really see are these just practiced public events. But we actually were brought in, it wasn't all, every group went in discreetly, individually. And we were there for 5 days, and we had a whole agenda. It's very controlled, but the point is they are trying to talk to us, even if it's in a very, limited way, and get their message out.
I have 2 sets of questions I want to continue with, but get ready, because we're going to open this up. We have about a half an hour before our next panel. And the first set of questions are on this issue of what do you think are the options for the United States? I think we just heard Chris Ford say, and I believe this is the U.S. position, that we cannot tolerate a nuclear-armed North Korea. And I don't quite understand what they mean by that, because North Korea has been nuclear-armed since, let's say, 2006, when they tested during the George W. Bush administration. They've now conducted 6 tests. I believe the last test was a genuine hydrogen bomb, was a full-up, 2-stage thermonuclear device. I believe they have tested missiles at ICBM range. I believe they could put a thermonuclear weapon on one of those missiles and hit at least the west coast of the United States. I believe that they are a nuclear-armed state. But the position is that we can't tolerate that. What does that mean? And what do you think the administration means by that? Go.
Well, on the one hand, you could say it's their maximum position, that they, short of being in negotiations, they have to maintain that really the only satisfactory answer is that North Korea is deprived of its nuclear weapons. But as you say, it's impractical, and frankly, I just don't see that happening. So if it's just a rhetorical, negotiating device, that's one thing. If they actually mean it, we're in big trouble, because I don't really see how it happens.
How it happens?
How this country, even in concert with China, rolls back North Korea's nuclear program. That boat sailed a long time ago.
So the administration obviously needs to take a much more pragmatic approach, because North Korea is not going to be giving up its nuclear weapons anytime soon. So what I would recommend instead is keeping denuclearization as an end goal, but first engaging on other issues like perhaps a freeze for freeze sort of agreement, where they stop their nuclear and missile testing, and in exchange we adjust our exercises with the South Koreans. Talks about deterrence, getting their assurances that they're not going to transfer nuclear weapons, fissile material, dual technology, chemical, biological weapons to third parties. There's a lot to talk about short of denuclearization that are urgent. So we should put aside denuclearization for now, not abandon it, but let's get on with this.
Robert, is containing and deterring a nuclear-armed North Korea an option for the United States?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Suzanne?
So this conversation must be confusing for some people here, or at least I hope it is. So a long time ago in another universe, I said to, track 1 negotiation, I said to my opposite number, it is my personal view that the President of the United States will not allow your country to acquire nuclear weapons. The person was outraged that I would say this, and I insisted that this was just my personal view. I did work for the U.S. government. I was head of our delegation, but it was just my personal view. And it was based on a view that the words would not tolerate meant that if necessary, we would act with force, and if necessary, unilaterally, to stop them. And I thought that was true, and I said, I was to myself, why don't we get some deterrence out of this posture and, dissuade them from moving in that direction? That's what, Joe, what I thought your first question really went to. Yes. And by the way, nobody knows whether President Clinton would have launched the strike, which was ready to go. Read what Bill Perry said about this in 1994, had Jimmy Carter not parachuted into Pyongyang and all the rest happened, we went back to the negotiating table. My own view is that the president that I briefed about the spent fuel moving from the reactor to the pond, if it had moved to the reprocessing plant, we would have, to use the technical military term, whacked them. And that's what would have happened. We would not have tolerated it. That's what that means. Now, when you ask the question now, you notice how our colleagues took that question. To tolerate would mean that we were actually, or that ship has sailed, I believe Carol used that phrase. Not going to happen anytime soon, denuclearize was your phrase. To give Chris his due, what I got from that on this point, as I understood it, I liked. Because I think the position of the United States of America should be, we will not tolerate this. That does not mean any longer, now that red lines are now pink or something else, don't really count that much. It means that we will not officially de jure accept it. It's been true, as Joe said, for more than a decade. So you could say we're tolerating it. Tolerating it, but not de jure. So if you ask me, I would not use the language of my colleagues. I would say this is a situation in which if we had talks about talks, and I very much like what Suzanne said about how we should proceed, I think that's exactly, in my view, you have talks about talks, you go to those talks without any preconditions at all, and then you talk about what kind of what used to be called unilateral understandings we would have if we were going to remain at the table. And one that I would have is that our declared position for being there would be to move to a position in which there are no nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula. Now, I need that because I do not wish to legitimize the North Korean status changing from possessing nuclear weapons to becoming, and the phrase is, a nuclear weapon state, which sounds a lot like you just made them one of the 6. There used to be only 5, but then the United States did that wonderful deal with India. Never mind. So my view here is that the words we're not going to tolerate are okay now, but only because we've redefined the word tolerate. And secondly, for me, I want to be on the record. That doesn't matter how I'm on the record. I want the U.S. to be on the record as saying that our objective here, please listen, allies who are voluntary members of the NPT, we're not going to hang you out to dry and legitimize a North Korean nuclear weapons program. Our goal is going to be a non-nuclear weapons peninsula. In reality, how would we get there? Exactly as I imagine my colleagues would say we would, through a series of steps that include freeze, etc. The end game, though, for us, I don't think we should ever fall off, and that is a non-nuclear weapons peninsula.
Good. Suzanne, you wanted to jump in.
Yes, I think using the wording "we're not going to tolerate" is fine if you're able to have discussions with the North Koreans to explain what that means. Because my worry is when you use that language and at the same time you're threatening the use of military force, you're moving U.S. strategic and military assets into the Pacific, you're conducting decapitation exercises, you're heightening military maneuvers, B-1 bombers, which are special irritants to the North Koreans. That together sends a message that military options is preferred and diplomacy is second to that. And I think we need to be very clear that diplomacy is our first choice.
Excellent. Let me open it up for questions now. I have a whole bunch more. I'm going to recognize Tyler Wigg-Stevens first. Catherine, if you would bring him the mic.
Tyler Wigg-Stevenson, Plowshare's Board of Directors. Thanks for this great panel. I was struck by something as I was listening to the panel and thinking about our previous speaker and thinking what might be hidden in plain sight, which he sort of referred to in his changed job description, that he is in charge of counterproliferation. And it got me thinking that the North Koreans understand themselves as being the counterexample of history. They're not going to go the way of Libya. They're not going to go the way of of Iraq, and they've said as much. And I wonder to what extent you could see forces working right now that see armed conflict as a necessary result of North Korea having taken the step of nuclearization to prove what happens to those who proliferate. That this becomes an example that shows nuclear weapons, or give up your nuclear weapons one way, give up your nuclear weapons another way. This example is not going to be allowed to persist, as that being a possible animating drive within the current government.
I think it's a consideration to send that message, but at what cost, I would ask. A military option, military leaders, former and current, that I've spoken to, don't see it as a viable option without enormous casualties and destruction. So if it's just to send a message to keep others from doing it, I'd say that's not a sufficient reason.
I would agree. I'm asking whether or not, I'm asking you to do mind reading, which obviously nobody can do, but to what extent do you think that might be driving? That some people might accept significant war with significant deaths as a consequence of, or as a cost of preserving conflict.
Here's how you can get from here to there and appear still to be moderately rational. That in the administration, I'm certain, and certainly outside the administration, where I've had this, literally the conversation I'm about to describe to you, the proposition is that we cannot tolerate the North Korean nuclear weapons program, certainly not made it with an ICBM capability. And we cannot because North Korea is not a status quo power. When I've met with them in the past and they've explained about Iraq and Libya and not them, as Suzanne has described, they say this with passion, and a lot of us believe them, and so we start thinking with them of how else we might reassure you, particularly in the wake of the collapse of the agreed framework, and they became a point on the axis of evil. How do we become credible that we're not going to change their regime? So for some of us, this becomes the challenge of the negotiation, should we ever get into one. For others, wrong question, because they're not a status quo power. What they want nuclear weapons for is to fracture the alliance so the United States will not honor its alliance responsibilities to the ROK. And once they've done that, because they've made us vulnerable, and we will in fact not trade San Francisco for Seoul, then they can turn their attention to the South, a non-nuclear weapon state, and simply blackmail them into unifying the peninsula under the government in Pyongyang. Now that's a different model than the one a lot of us have when we talk to North Koreans. And if you're going to get to the point in which you're going to be tolerating this North Korean capability, you should be, if you're one of those folks, persuading yourself that the idea that the North Koreans have, pardon the expression, grand strategy that involves fracturing the alliance, and that nothing is going to dissuade them, and that that's what they're all about, then this makes some sense.
Good. Other questions?
Chris Preble with the Cato Institute. More mind reading on the part, you can get into the minds of the administration. If North Korea conducts a ICBM test at range with a warhead and detonates the warhead, would the administration interpret that as though it were an attack itself? Would they actually treat that as justification, not merely for an attack left of launch, Bob, as you said, not merely trying to preempt on the launch pad, but would they retaliate against a test as though it were an attack?
I'm pretty sure I'm right, that an atmospheric detonation, whether it be somewhere over the Pacific, and you've made it very exciting, where you take a missile that hasn't come any place near the kind of testing that we would require before an IOC, before we'd put it in our inventory, right? That they had actually put a warhead, which the Chinese did this once, right? We don't do that. We don't put warheads on our missiles when we're testing them because they fail. I mean, even without cyber attacks, they simply fail. That's what
We
it's
actually
about.
did do it once.
Yeah, no,
A
yeah.
long time ago.
But it was a very long time ago.
It was.
Right? It was. So what I'm saying is, to answer your question, if the North Koreans are identified as responsible for an atmospheric burst of a nuclear weapon in the Pacific, the U.S. military, the command authority, will take it as an attack with a nuclear weapon on continental United States with all that implies.
I think that's true. But even though we detonated 100 thermonuclear devices in the South Pacific, that was us. This is them. We would see it as a direct threat, and there would be no disagreement with the President of the United States if he were to decide that he would wanted to launch an attack in response to that. Do you agree with that, Carol?
Well, I was going to say, precisely because we have these kinds of situations, the military knows exactly, or thinks at least, they know what they would do in a case like that. The North Koreans, I don't think, really understand what the United States would do in response to each elevation, escalation in their activities. And that's a real danger because, and all the more reason why somebody's got to be talking to them, somebody in authority with credibility needs to be talking to them now.
Right. Other questions, please. No. Well, I'm sorry. Well, we're just about out of time. So I just have one. No, we are. We have to move along. But before I go, I want to recognize Tom Kalina for one last question.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. My question goes to the issue of the military exercises in South Korea and your sense of whether that's something that can be traded for a freeze of North Korean missile and nuclear testing, and how we as a community frame that as something acceptable that wouldn't be a surrender to the North. Thank you.
So 3 quick points in that. First, for the uninitiated, military exercises can be of all kinds of things, from headquarters type exercises that are paper-like and very useful, to field exercises, right, which is what the North Koreans are unhappy about. And Suzanne has it right. They really don't like us doing anything and saying we're practicing decapitation today. That's, for some reason, they're offended by that, right? And the fact that the B-1B is no longer dual capable, they're not interested in that. They know it's a strategic bomber. It left from Guam, and they can see it, so they don't like it, right? So, military exercises a couple of things you accomplish with military exercises. One is you maintain your readiness or improve your readiness to go to war. And the second thing is you're doing combined operations, and so you want to work with your ally, and you do things together, and you make sure stuff works. But the full-blown exercises aren't always necessary. And these days, or in the last 15, maybe even 20 years, have become a lot less important, and certainly the ones we do with the ROC can be adjusted enormously without any damage to either the ability to conduct combined operations or to readiness. So that's the first point. Second point is that this is a bad atmosphere for dialing back military exercises. I mean, you may think it's a great atmosphere, because it would allow maybe this is the road to negotiations. The Chinese propose this, but it's very hard. I would say, particularly for the ROC, I found out, to say, yeah, this is a time we're going to ask the Americans to cooperate with us to decrease the profile of our military exercises, which is what we would be really talking about, because the president of South Korea, has a domestic issue about how to deal with this. In South Korea, the North Korean issue is not a foreign policy issue. It's a domestic policy issue and a foreign policy issue. So it's everything. And this is the atmosphere isn't ideal, and neither ally, in my view, can push this or should push this without the concurrence of the other, right? So you need to, and the third point is there is a little bit of a problem in some people's minds about establishing an equivalency between activity which the United Nations has decided to sanction, ballistic missile tests, nuclear weapons tests, and military exercises the U.S. conducts with its allies, right? That say, okay, you stop that, you freeze that, we'll freeze this, and now we can go to the table, et cetera. There are some people who don't like the equivalence there. So you have to have a different frame for that. None of these things make it beyond the possibility, but I could see this more easily happening if I took Suzanne's model of you meet without preconditions, and then you talk about the unilateral understandings under which, on our side, we would remain at the table, and we would say no more tests, ballistic or other, and they would have a unilateral understanding, no more provocative exercises, et cetera. So I can imagine that happening a lot more easily than having an agreement beforehand.
Suzanne.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment. The previous speaker, Chris Ford, someone asked him a question about the current policy towards North Korea. The Trump's new policy is maximum pressure and engagement. So where's the engagement? What's the strategy? And I thought his answer was not completely satisfactory, if I could put it that way. And I think we should be real. This isn't a case where we could look to the example of the diplomacy with the Iranians, because the Obama administration really hit the sweet spot when they pivoted from pressure to engagement. And of course, they're two very different cases. I would argue we'll never have the kind of pressure against North Korea that we had against Iran. It's just not going to happen. And this may actually be it. We just had two very strong UN Security Council resolutions with two new sets of sanctions passed that are tougher than we've seen before, combined with some unilateral sanctions. So maybe this is the time to think to pivot to engagement. And what we did with the Iranians was we pointed to an off-ramp, which I think is very important to do with the North Koreans, and we offered something to the Iranians in exchange, and that was a concession, really, where we said, this is your red line. You require being able to enrich uranium on your soil. We're going to give that to you. It's going to be highly monitored, highly verified, strictly limited. We need to have the same approach with the North Koreans. We've built up this pressure. I don't understand why this administration isn't constantly calling attention to that accomplishment. It was multilateral. The Russians came on board, the Chinese. So put that up there, pivot to some form of engagement, provide that off-ramp, yes. And what is that concession that we can give them that's going to let them know that this is a serious effort?
So many have caroled the last word here, which is, I like your honest assessment of how much confidence you have in this administration's ability to get us out of this alive, to negotiate some sort of settlement here. What do you think is going to happen?
Thanks for the easy question. I'm not confident at all. I really am. I'm every day, the more I hear from different people, the more alarmed I become about where we're going. And when the Secretary of State said the other day on television something about we're going to negotiate with them until the bombs drop, I just don't get where that's going. So it's very alarming to me. That's why I say there has to, everything that Suzanne and Bob have said, we need to find some sort of alternative path, some creative, innovative, wild thing that will allow the two sides to start talking. I will say, though, the whole question of this freeze for freeze, the people we talked to in Pyongyang didn't really seem to be very interested in that, and it was the North Koreans who initially put that on the table, so they seem to be walking back from it.
Go ahead.
Just one quick suggestion. What this administration could do right away is the president has a very important trip coming up in Asia. What he can do is when he's in these various capitals is instead of personally insulting Kim Jong-un, he could throw his support behind the idea of diplomatic engagement. He could make a strong case for it and say he's going to let the diplomats do their job.
I just want to say I'm sure he will.
Thank you very much. This is the most difficult foreign policy challenge we face. Thank you for your insights.